Welcome everyone to the Ali Houston Transforms podcast. I'm a former physicist who fixed my brain using nutrition. I now coach people to empower them to do the same. So if you or anyone you know could benefit from a mental health tune-up, head over to metsci.com, where myself and psychiatrist Dr. Rachel Brown coach you to better mental health. And today's episode is part of the series on autoimmune, something very close to my heart. Autoimmune diseases are very common and sometimes a bit mysterious in the medical community. You'd recognize a lot of the names of autoimmune diseases: multiple sclerosis, pernicious anemia, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, lupus, and two that I had: sarcoidosis, achalasia of the cardia, other ones that run in my family, like alopecia or vitiligo. The list goes on and on. And my kind of introduction to it was around ancestral eating, particularly kind of the work of Weston Price, traveling around, seeing people eating in particular ways 100 years ago or so, and then being very healthy compared to modern so-called advanced societies. And I heard about a researcher called Alessio Fasano, Italian, working in America mainly, and he described this mechanism of zonulin and leaky tight junctions in the gut, so that certain foods, particularly gluten and sometimes casein and other things, dysregulating the tight junctions in the gut, leading to things inappropriately getting into the bloodstream, leading to autoimmunity. And it's a simplistic picture, but it's how I came to kind of understand the basics of autoimmunity and where my issues might have stemmed from, and certainly influenced my decision to give up gluten and ultimately casein, which was much harder. So I'm really happy to have Julianne Taylor with me, who was recommended to me by Dr. Emily Deans on Twitter. And I just want to welcome you, Julianne, and say thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks. And hi, everyone.
So could you maybe just comment a bit on my wee intro there about what I think autoimmune is, and then you kind of go into your background and how you came to look at autoimmune stuff.
I'm a huge fan of Fasano. I think his model of what contributes to autoimmunity, I think, is something that I have certainly taken on board with my research. So in terms of how I understand it and how it fits in with the research I've been doing, so just to say where I'm at with that is I'm a PhD candidate. I'm a couple of years in now, about a year and a half to go. And I'm looking at dietary strategies for rheumatoid arthritis. So I'm particularly focusing on rheumatoid arthritis as one autoimmune disease. But what we see contributing to autoimmunity is, first of all, and Fasano points this out, is first of all a genetic predisposition. So the most obvious one is with celiac disease, where you have HLA, DQ2 and DQ8, the main genes associated with celiac disease. And there are associations with genes that they are finding constantly with autoimmune disease. So there's that. There is a big element of dysbiosis. So with many autoimmune diseases, what we see is people often think of it as bad bacteria and good bacteria, but it can be more like an overgrowth of what we call pathobionts. So it's bacteria that's already there, but it grows in quantities or in a way that becomes pathogenic. So it's out of balance bacteria. And also we have a lack of species, so there's a lack of diversity in the bacteria. So, and you talked about zonulin. So the two main triggers of zonulin are gluten. And what's interesting about gluten is that, as Fasano said, there's a spectrum. So some people are highly sensitive to gluten, and in celiac disease, it will trigger zonulin, which then just opens up the tight junctions. However, in people with gluten sensitivity, a similar thing happens, but not to quite the same extent. So they do see zonulin there as well. The other thing that triggers the release of zonulin is dysbiosis, bad bacteria, dysbiotic bacteria. So that is quite a big trigger of zonulin as well. So when you have both together, that is probably not great. And as Fasano said, is a belligerent immune system. And the immune system is, I guess it's becomes poorly, what's the word? It isn't created properly when we're young. And just as a sort of a sideline, there's a really interesting study where in Europe, two areas, Finland and Karelian Russia, two areas bordering next to each other with groups of people with exactly the same genetic background. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they have 4 times the rate of autoimmune disease in Finland compared to Karelian Russia, which is exactly across the border. One is highly rural, and people have a lot of, they're in contact with the soil and bacteria and infections from a very young age, which primes the immune system in a different way than people across the border. And there's an interesting association between the number of household vacuum cleaners and the amount of soil that is covered with asphalt and the amount of autoimmune issues. And
What an interesting study. It's kind of like
yeah,
a really neat control that you had the Iron Curtain there to help you out with a control group. And
yeah,
you hear this a lot. People talk about, the hygiene hypothesis and there being advantages to being in nature for so many reasons, but not least that you're actually getting bacteria from a young age and training your immune system in the formative years, which I guess starts from the moment you come out your mother's womb, because you come out not totally sterile, but more, in many ways you're inoculated by the first thing you come into contact with. So babies that are born C-section, they're kind of inoculated. The gut is largely inoculated by whatever's on the hands of the midwife or the healthcare professional delivering you. And that's not how babies born the natural way would be inoculated. And you're already off to a bad start because you're more likely to have this dysregulation of your gut bacteria. But then imagine then a dozen or so courses of antibiotics over your first kind of 18 years of life, maybe even eating kind of modern foods in large quantities. What chance do we have of having a healthy gut microbiome, given all that, plus the fact that we live in semi-sterile, over vacuumed environments?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just super interesting. It just seems to be a huge contributor to your predisposition to get autoimmune disease. And And I guess, my take on it is, well, okay, well, we know this is going on. What can we do to reverse, or 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 at least reduce the effect of the autoimmune disease? Like, we know that there's this dysbiosis. We know that there's a reduced range of bacteria. We know there's intestinal hyperpermeability, to use the more accurate term, over leaky gut, where antigens, whether they're bacterial antigens or food antigens, can cross the epithelial barrier and come in contact with the immune system on the other side. But also, it appears that these bacteria can float around, or bacterial fragments or peptides can float around in the bloodstream and make their way to tissues where there's molecular mimicry, or the fact that they're in those tissues creates an immune response and an inflammatory response. And so we know that focusing on the gut can be one thing that can make a difference in autoimmune disease, both increasing bacterial diversity, decreasing dysbiosis, and decreasing intestinal permeability, so we're not getting those antigens crossing the gut.
And so
But,
that's kind of, it's good to establish the kind of triggers and basic idea behind what causes autoimmune problems. There's still a little bit of a mystery in my mind about why, for example, I ended up with sarcoidosis, which, for people who haven't heard of that, is a bit of a strange one. It kind of affects multiple tissues throughout the body. And the way it was diagnosed was you get a kind of target-shaped rash on your skin sometimes. And I had a chest X-ray as routine for another problem that I'd had. One of my consultant doctors called me the encyclopedia, because I had so many things wrong with me over the years that I was like a reference book for students. But they found this shadow on the lung X-ray, and took a biopsy, and it was a granuloma associated with sarcoidosis. So it's benign, but it's there. It can cause breathing problems. It can be progressive. It can go to your retinas. So they had to test my retinas to see if, because it can blind you. So that's like not a nice autoimmune disease to have. And when I changed my diet, it reversed, really. So it's not there anymore, which is great. I also, had achalasia of the cardia, where my esophagus closed up, and I had to have balloon dilation of the esophagus as a child, quite rare in children. And that allowed me to eat normally again, more or less. But it's not clear to me why that happened to me, and why other family members might have, vitiligo or pernicious anemia, or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or type 1 diabetes. What is it about is it the gut bacteria specifically? Is it the individual's genes? Is it something about where it leaks through in the gut? Do we know why individuals get particular autoimmune diseases or not?
I don't know. I don't know why they get particular. I mean, I'm not an immunologist, so my background is nutrition, and I'm also a registered nurse. But immunology is like incredibly complex, and I think it's, as far as I'm understanding, it's related to your HLA types and how you present antigens to your immune system, and then the antibodies, which are made in response to the antigens that you present. And making auto antibodies as a result of what you present to the immune system. And it could be to do with both your genotype and particular gut bacteria, because gut bacteria, if there's either food antigens or bacterial antigens, that look, or these peptides or sequences of amino acids, if they look like your tissue, because of their sequence, and they're presented to the immune system and you react to those, that's called molecular mimicry, which you're probably familiar with. And then we react to any tissue that looks the same as that amino acid sequence that we have created antibodies to. So that's where molecular mimicry comes into play, and that could be part of the picture.
Yeah, and it kind of raises the question of, like you said earlier, how do we then deal with that kind of gut dysbiosis, damage that might be there? What chance do people have? I know that you've written in your blog about how some people seem to get better with different dietary modes. Some people don't, or at least not straight away. So how does that tend to go with people using diet for autoimmune, do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, just to give you some background before I get into that, because I hadn't talked about myself. So I got into nutrition because way back in the 90s, the popular diet of the day was the zone diet. And it made a big difference to like my appetite regulation, stopped me having reactive hypoglycemia, a lot more energy because my protein content was bumped up.
And what was the zone diet specifically?
The zone diet is the 30-30-40 diet. So 30% calories from protein, 30% from fat, and 40% calories from carbohydrates. So you're supposed to have that balance at each of your meals. And the idea behind the balance is that you have a balance between the hormones that are released in response to carbohydrates, which is insulin, and in response to protein, which is glucagon. And by having a balance between insulin and glucagon, you also create a balance between some prostaglandin hormones. And anyway, there's a whole theory around it, but it's all about balance and blood sugar regulation, insulin glucagon balance. So that's the theory, and I felt really, really good on that diet. And also Barry Sears, who designed it, he is a big proponent of omega-3 and the omega-3 and omega-6 balance. So that also changed, and I started taking omega-3, and my joint inflammation, which I had since I was 18, started improved quite a lot. But things would come and go. Sometimes it'd be good, sometimes not so good. And then I started working with a CrossFit gym, and started reading about Lorraine Cordain's work and Rob Wolf and the whole ancestral health and paleo. And I thought, I've got to try this because my joint inflammation is very similar to my mother, and my mother has lupus. We have autoimmune diseases in my family. I also have Hashimoto's. So I tried the paleo diet, and within 3 weeks, my joint inflammation was like gone, and a big ganglion cyst that I had on my hand, my wrist, went away. And I used to get these ganglion cysts all the time on my wrists, and I've never had them since I've been on the paleo diet, but I've pretty much linked it to gluten. So I can eat most foods, but I avoid gluten a little bit. Probably doesn't do me much harm, but yeah, I avoid it. And I haven't had any joint inflammation for over 10 years now. And that was when I started looking at the whole diet and autoimmune disease, and I became really interested and heard about some people while I was doing my postgrad diploma in nutrition, heard about some people with rheumatoid arthritis who had improved on a paleo autoimmune protocol. And my first little bit of research was to do 10 qualitative interviews with these people that had improved, and just find out all about, how they put it into practice, what they discovered, what was easy, what was difficult, what foods they reacted to. And that kind of led on to my research where I am now, where I did a pilot study on the autoimmune protocol with a group of 9 people to just test that out, because it's all very well hearing anecdotal stories of success, but that doesn't tell you if a whole group of people do the same diet, will it be successful with everybody or not? So 1 out of 9 people it wasn't successful for. 6 out of 9 it was effective. 2 out of 9 had not much change. So that was interesting. So sorry, the next question is, so I'm like exploring, like, well, what can we do to help autoimmune disease? So as you've said, removing certain foods seems to make a difference, and perhaps it's because, like gluten, they trigger zonulin in some people. We know that there's been some interesting studies where 50% of a woman did rectal patches, and so up your bum with a rectal patch of gluten in people with celiac disease, and the same with casein. And 50% of people with celiac disease have an inflammatory response to casein in their rectal epithelial tissue. And similarly, in rheumatoid arthritis, she also did studies with rheumatoid arthritis and found that a certain percentage of people had a rectal inflammatory reaction to gluten and casein. And it was even larger in one of the other inflammatory joint diseases, much larger than in rheumatoid arthritis. So it appears that in certain vulnerable people, foods which otherwise in other people are completely fine cause an inflammatory reaction in the gut epithelial tissue, which leads to leaky gut, which means that bacterial components and food antigens can cross over more easily. So I guess the idea behind a kind of ancestral diet, or taking out foods that you're reactive to, is taking out foods that for you are inflammatory at the gut epithelium, and may act as like an allergen as well when they interact with your immune system.
Yeah, it can be like a two-stage thing, can't it? That I get this inappropriate opening of tight junctions in the gut and letting bacteria in that shouldn't be in the bloodstream, letting food particles that shouldn't be in the bloodstream in, makes sense to me. It's pretty solidly established now. It used to be fringe, and now people just accept it's true. Fasano's done such incredible work there. And I also get the logic of why casein would do it, on the basis of tight junctions in the breast and breastfeeding, and how casein, the protein that's in milk, can drive that process so that the baby is able to continue to feed. So the tight junctions in the breast being very similar to the ones in the gut. So I get that casein would potentially open tight junctions in the gut through a similar mechanism, but then, it really is a kind of infant food, isn't it? So you might not expect adults to continually expose their gut to milk proteins that might do that, even though some people, as you say, seem to do okay, and some people seem to do okay with raw and pasteurized milk and or different types of casein and so on. But there's this distinction to be made between something which can open tight junctions and something which actually causes inflammation. So do you think that that casein can be inflammatory up front, or do you think that happens further down the line after the gut barrier's been kind of broken, and then the body's had some kind of time to generate antibodies to milk that's actually got into the blood over the years? Or what do you think's going on there?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. Yeah, I do know, like, from another study in rheumatoid, where allergen proteins were put into the jejunum, which is a part of the gut much further up, by the small intestine, and they had an antibody reaction to those, and like it was soy and pork and eggs and dairy, and I can't remember a couple of others. And in the gut of people with rheumatoid arthritis, they had this immune response right at the epithelial level. It didn't actually transfer into the bloodstream as such. It was at the at the interface of the gut, whereby the people that didn't have rheumatoid arthritis, the healthy controls, they didn't have that immune reaction. So there seems to be something there as well, like an immune response in the gut epithelium to certain allergenic foods or peptides. And I don't know how that kind of triggers the rheumatoid arthritis or whatever, whether it's inflammatory, and yeah, I don't know. There's a lot I don't know. Like I said, I'm not an immunologist, so there's also probably a lot I don't understand. But I do find it interesting that people with rheumatoid arthritis react differently to foods than people that are unaffected.
Yeah, there seems to be like a kind of spectrum of susceptibility to autoimmune diseases, and people react in different ways. And it's like trying to put together a series on autoimmune. I was looking for experts, and people's names came up from all different disciplines. And like you say, immunology is obviously appropriate, but even then you'll only get part of the picture, because they're looking at what happens once the reactions are taking place. And I was talking to you before about how, I've collected a few autoimmune diseases. My family is it's like an autoimmune bomb site. Sounds like yours is to some extent. But when we were all going through these problems in Glasgow, in Scotland, we weren't sent to the one doctor, the autoimmune doctor, who would do root cause analysis on it and say, this is what's likely causing it for all of you. You're sharing a lot of genes there, and think about the people in Finland and Russia. There's a huge environmental component. So let's deal with the environment and sort it out. No, we were all sent to individual specialists for the particular tissue or the organs that were affected by whatever autoimmune diseases we happen to have. And then presumably that was the same for you. So yeah, it's admirable that you're saying, I don't know everything here, but I think that's true for anyone who's talking about autoimmune.
Oops.
Did you lose me for a second
there for a moment? Pardon?
Did you lose me for a second there?
I did. My internet connection's unstable. Not usual. We do have, anyway, shouldn't be, but we're back.
Well, I mean, I was just basically saying that the type of care given to people with autoimmune diseases is unstable. So, it's not surprising, given that's how it is, that people kind of, when they're asked to talk on autoimmune, they quite often just say, listen, that's too big a subject. And it makes me think about the sort of 3 people in your study of 9, your pilot study, who the autoimmune protocol didn't help, because they really interest me. Obviously, it's brilliant that 6 people found relief from rheumatoid arthritis just with a very specific change in diet. What's going on with the others, do you think?
That's a very good question. In my study, one of the small problems I had was that not everybody came in with, so I did some questionnaires to find out where on the spectrum from 0 to 10 in disease activity they fell, and 2 people were right down at 1, but I just took the first 10 people dropped out, unfortunately, with a broken ankle. Yeah, so there was a little change with those two because they didn't have a high starting point, but they didn't seem to have a lot of other sort of positive benefits. I mean, they some, but not massive, because I asked other questions as well. Yeah, and the one person who got worse, she completely lost her appetite, which was quite strange. And she was one who didn't need to lose weight, but she lost weight despite not wanting to lose weight. So I don't know. There's work I haven't yet done, which is analyzing the diet, 3-day diet. So I collected 3-day diet diaries 4 times during the study, and again a year later I followed up on everybody a year after I'd completed it, and I haven't analyzed those yet, so I don't know if there's a connection there. Yeah, but so I don't know. Good question, and don't know. And the other thing is, that's come up. So the other part of my research project is I'm looking at studies done in rheumatoid arthritis that have an element of food challenge or food reintroduction. So they could have an elimination diet and a food challenge, or just some kind of fasting overnight and various food challenges. So I'm collecting studies and case studies where that has occurred and where they've been able to measure or observe a response to foods when they're challenged. And what's interesting is in the studies that have kind of gathered a bit more data, there's about 30 to 40% of people who are able to identify foods that trigger or flare their arthritis, and on removal, they improve, their arthritis improves. So what's common to some of those people? I'm also looking at, well, are there patterns? Can we predict what people might be more likely to have success on an elimination diet? People with other allergies seem to be more responsive. So they might have like, arthritis, hay fever or eczema or other sort of environmental allergies. They seem to be a little bit more responsive. People that had rheumatoid arthritis for the longest period of time were less responsive. And this particular woman in my study had it for the longest time of anybody else, so that may be a factor.
So it almost sounds like it could be that the extent of the damage to the tissue involved can leave you needing to do it for longer to feel a benefit, if there can be any. Some tissue takes, collagen, or is it collagen I'm thinking of? Cartilage can be like 10, 20 year half-life. So you're probably, if you're 50 or 60, you're probably actually not going to see, regrowth or improvement on some tissues meaningfully. But then there's the, inflammation can die down. So if there's these secondary or tertiary effects, then they can be helped. But sometimes tissue is just really damaged, isn't it?
Yeah, especially with rheumatoid, you can see quite severe joint damage in some people. The modern drugs do slow that down a lot compared to the older drugs. Yeah, so that's a factor. But there are other things I looked at in one of my questionnaires, which was fatigue and sleep. And overall, there was a big reduction in fatigue and a big improvement in sleep. And what's interesting about fatigue is that even with all the modern biological DMARDs and other medications, the immune suppressant medications that do slow the disease process, fatigue is something that has continued to be an issue in people with rheumatoid arthritis. So that was, I think, one positive that came out of my pilot study. But of course, it's a pilot study and it's only 9 people, so that would have to be replicated in a larger RCT as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned fatigue, because I'm interviewing Tess Failer, who's doing the remission biome experiment for chronic fatigue syndrome ME, she changed her diet and noticed the difference, but thinks that I think the story, I'll get the full story when I record the podcast with her, is that she had a course of antibiotics, and I'm not sure if it was meant to be therapeutic for chronic fatigue, but the result was 80% or so remission of her chronic fatigue syndrome symptoms. So I'll definitely be asking her about autoimmune, but is that something, I mean, when you say fatigue, do people with rheumatoid arthritis sometimes cross over into a chronic fatigue diagnosis as well?
Probably. I think with rheumatoid, people think of it as a joint autoimmune disease. It's a systemic autoimmune disease. It's not just joints. It gives people fatigue. It affects multiple organs as well, so it can affect kidneys, lungs, heart, cardiovascular system. So I think thinking of it as a systemic disease that creates or causes fatigue as part of the disease process is probably a better way of looking at it.
And I guess for people with that presentation, the joint damage and pain is the kind of most obvious part of it to them because it's so debilitating.
Yeah, true.
How did it affect you, and what was it like getting better?
I didn't have anything really bad, so and I haven't been positively diagnosed with any autoimmune issue other than I have identical symptoms to my mother who had lupus. Exactly the same joints, exactly the same knee swelling, neck pain, and jaw inflammation, and also a positive anti-nuclear antibody, but not strongly positive. So it indicated autoimmune inflammation, but I guess how did it make a difference? I think it's like sometimes that, like I just had years and years of my sore, stiff neck and my joints and my jaw, which sometimes meant that it was really difficult to chew and eat. And my knee that swelled up every time I went for a decent sized walk. It was just like, that's just part of your life, and it's just that kind of niggle you learn to live with. And when it first went away, I was so like, I can't believe this is happening. Like my father's a doctor, and I was like, Dad, my knee hasn't swelled up since I've been on this diet. It's amazing. And look, my ganglion cyst gone away. And as a result of that, my mother also went onto a paleo diet, and she had small airways disease as part of her lupus, which is what's called bronchiectasis, which is basically inflammation in the little small parts of the lung. Which caused her quite a lot of discomfort, and she had to sort of have physio and drain her lungs and stuff like that. But in 3 weeks on the paleo diet, her lung inflammation just dramatically cleared up. And my father was like, I can't quite believe this has happened, but your mum's lungs are so much better. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. It's amazing the difference in quality of life. Like the reason I started metsci.com and the reason I switched career really from kind of doing physics and engineering into the different things I've done in this space is the profound effect it had on my mental health. And you've talked about inflammation and antibody response kind of downstream of gut dysbiosis and gut barrier problems. I am, convinced that there's a very strong link between gluten, casein, the sort of main autoimmune offenders, and certain mental disorders that's not necessarily like a one-to-one correlation, but it depends on your genes and your environmental history and your gut history and all the rest of it. But you know, some mental disorders I think can be seen as autoimmune disorders. You know, did you have you seen that much in terms of any kind of mental health changes beyond just being happier that you don't have as much rheumatoid arthritis either in yourself or in someone else who you've worked with?
I It's not something I've focused on, so I can't really comment. Yeah, I mean, people talk about energy levels improving, just feeling better in themselves. I mean, it makes sense that the brain is affected, with the gut-brain connection, which goes both ways. And, if you've got dysbiotic bacteria are like little metabolite factories. And if you've got metabolites that then affect your brain because they cross the brain barrier, or they cause systemic inflammation because they're floating around in your system, and you're reacting and creating inflammation in general in your body, it makes sense that it affects your brain. And we know with non gluten sensitivity, not celiac disease, that brain fog is a common symptom of that. So there's definitely a systemic effect from either the food itself, or perhaps via the leaky gut, and you're getting metabolites and inflammatory components in the bloodstream, which then affect your brain, or the metabolites of the dysbiosis, or all three. Yeah, I'm not sure about the autoimmune side of it. I know that my mother also had a lot of brain inflammation and brain shrinkage, and my father, yeah, it was kind of discovered by accident. Like she got knocked over by a car, and they decided to do an MRI scan of her brain. And my dad was like, he was just shocked at how much brain shrinkage she had, and they suspect it's part of the kind of cardiovascular inflammation to do with her lupus. So there's that as well, the inflammatory component in the blood vessels that could also affect the brain.
Very interesting. The body's sort of always seeming more and more complex in a way. And the deeper you look, there's all these different potential reactions going on. What do you think about other lifestyle changes in terms of rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune? A lot's made about different types of light and ancestrally appropriate this, that, or the other thing. And as a sort of physicist engineer background, you're taught about the Pareto principle, where if you deal with sort of the major 20% of the causes, you'll deal with 80% of the results. And so I think diet is huge, but it's not everything. I personally don't feel at my best unless I do some exercise, make sure I've got time for people in my life that I want to spend time with, and hobbies that I can get into a flow state with, and pastime, light, getting out in the sun. These are the things that work well for me. But have you noticed that there's kind of correlation with your ancestral background with your rheumatoid arthritis and people you've worked with?
Me personally, with my joint inflammation, and just general well-being, I mean, I know sleep is huge, stress is huge, exercise is huge, eating well is super important. Certain supplements make a difference. Yeah, I mean, I like personally to have all of those things in place. And it's not an area that I've gone into with my research, but I know anecdotally stress is a big one with rheumatoid arthritis. people can have, every time they have a stressor in their life, they get a flare of rheumatoid. That certainly comes up really frequently with people that I've worked with. Could be psychological stress, work stress, family, whatever. Or it could be, I heard of one guy that had a minor car accident and it was enough to give him a flare. It wasn't even like he got injured. It just this I don't know, the stress response that your body goes through was enough to set off a flare.
Yeah, when I was doing blood tests during one of my dietary experiments, my C-reactive protein went up when I had an infected cut on my finger. These
Right.
small things can actually they can make a measurable difference. I'm very interested about you mentioned supplements because it's a kind of contentious area. Some people think it just gives you expensive pee, but then I know that I've felt a difference, and that it was actually something that Emily Deans had linked to around people needing massive doses of a particular B vitamin if they've had historical autoimmune attacks on the receptor for that B vitamin. So even if you dial in everything with your diet and lifestyle, then your autoimmune history has damaged the receptors for this B vitamin. So you could eat, I think it was B6. You could eat B6 sandwiches for lunch, breakfast, and dinner, and still not get enough B6. You need to actually have the supplement, the bioavailable form, and probably zinc, which is used with so often in the body. And that's certainly been my experience, is that periodically, if I feel anxiety coming on for no particular reason whatsoever, I supplement with B6, with P5P, the bioactive form of B6, and zinc, usually picolinate, because it's well absorbed and doesn't hurt my stomach, for a couple of days. And even after sort of 90 minutes, when I take the first dose, I can feel a difference sometimes. It's remarkable. So I think supplements have a place for sure. And my technique is to say, you could do a DNA test like 23andMe or Ancestry and get a sort of arrow in the ground best first guess of where to start with supplements, and then just sort of pare them back until you're spending the minimum on what's effective for you. But also there's sort of reasonable first places to start that tend to not harm anyone. So vitamin D3, vitamin K2, sometimes the B vitamins with a couple of cofactors can make immediate positive impacts, because these things aren't stored very well most of the time. So you can usually tell a difference straight away. And so it is complicated, but it can be simplified. And I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on supplements.
I mean, I personally feel better when I take certain supplements, and I tend to recommend them to clients. So just to sort of backtrack a little bit, what was interesting about my study is there was no anybody that was taking supplements had been on a stable dose for 8 weeks or longer, and they weren't to change during the study. And also their medication had to be stable as well. So the changes that I saw in the study were purely diet, and there was no lifestyle changes. There's nothing else changed in their life as far as I could manage apart from the diet, and some had quite dramatic improvement. Like 4 had clinically meaningful responses, which means if it was a drug, it was a good response to the drug. So that's supplements. But personally, that sort of goes back to the Julia Rutledge work. I don't know if you looked at hers or talked to her about using high doses of multi-nutrients in people with mental health disorders, ADHD, stress responses, things like that, and getting some really interesting results, really good results. I just feel better. haven't done anything particularly focused with my supplements. I do know from my my genes, I've got like multiple genes that predispose me to inflammation. So in my inflammatory ones, it's all reds and oranges apart from one, it's all like doesn't look good. So I'm not surprised I had a lot of kind of inflammation. But I don't have that now. It's not, it's like you. I don't have any systemic. I do powerlifting, I hold powerlifting records. I don't get joint issues. I don't get any inflammation in that arena at all. So I just tend to take a multivitamin, vitamin D in this winter, a little bit of K2, omega-3 periodically, or make sure I eat oily fish on a regular basis. I do like ubiquinol as well because it's got beneficial effects for powerlifting and strength. So I'm all for improving in that arena. And I find a little bit of NAC is good as well. There's an interesting study came out recently about NAC and glycine helping with age-related changes. So I take collagen as well for that reason.
Interesting.
And magnesium.
Magnesium is one of the ones that I've forgotten to say. It's like, you could probably drown in it before overdosing on it. Just about. It's people spray it on and feel much more relaxed and better. And the old Epsom salts bath. It's the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just magnesium basically. Yeah.
So NAC is an interesting one because that's something that came up for me when I first did my 23andMe and the analysis of that kind of probably about 6 years ago. And I could feel a difference with NAC. I've dropped it because it's, any of these things, they might add 10, 20, 30 pounds to your monthly outgoings. And if you don't need it and you're getting most of what you need from food, then great. But what difference do you notice with NAC?
Just a little bit more energy, really. Just a bit more energy and focus. Yeah. I mean, I think, it could be it could be placebo, who knows?
I guess over the long term, placebo tends to regress to the mean. So if it is, then if it is, then who cares if you're getting the effect and it's worth the money.
Yeah, well, I got some NAC powder, which is like 200 grams for about $30, so it's not hugely expensive.
Yeah, if you get the right molecule, that's the thing, isn't it? Because you can pay a lot for these, but you don't have to.
No, you don't. I mean, NAC is NAC. It's not like there's different, forms of it.
And where do you want your research to go? What's the big plan?
Oh gosh, finish the PhD, finish the marathon. Look, I'm just super interested in the connection between diet and autoimmune disease, and I'd love to sort of be able to, once this is written up, I think it deserves a bigger study, which would be great, but it's not something I would want to do by myself. I'd want to do it as part of a team and definitely get some funding. And all the things I'm learning about, like some of the measures that are different with people with rheumatoid arthritis, being able to do those tests as you go with dietary changes, looking at the microbiome, looking at leaky gut measures, a whole lot of things like that would be amazing to be able to do. So I like the research side, not enjoying the writing up side quite so much, but I did enjoy doing the research and working with people. I just love to see a bigger study done, and like I said, looking at the effects on gut dysbiosis and gut and permeability. So I'm sort of looking around some of this research at that at the moment, like the effect, some of the studies around the effect of fiber on short chain fatty acid production, which is a good measure of improvement in gut microbiome, and also polyphenols and the effect on zonulin levels and intestinal permeability. So definitely foods and fermented foods. So if there's anything I would say for people with autoimmune issues, besides perhaps cutting out foods that cause an inflammatory reaction in you, and they tend to be sort of the allergenic foods, so there's crossover there, is supporting your gut, fermented foods, certain fibers, and polyphenols, and trying to get a better range of gut bacteria and reduce the inflammation, intestinal permeability with foods. So I think that's part of the effect of like a clean diet or an ancestral diet or Mediterranean style diet, is the fact that you're using foods that improve your gut integrity in multiple ways.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The matching of the individual and where their gut is at the time, given their background and the damage they've gone through and their genes, with a diet that works for them, and that might change over time. And some people go the sort of nuclear option, as some people see it, and go carnivore and actually cut out anything that can cause more negative strains of bacteria to grow, and then over time the gut kind of adapts to what's coming in. And I guess there's an argument about short chain fatty acids. Maybe you can produce a couple of 100 calories a day with fiber, and maybe you can produce the same with a ketogenic diet. It's still a bit up in the air about exactly what's going to work for one person versus another. It'd be great to do a large study to understand, the what's and the whys of these things. And I hope that you can get into a team or ultimately put a team together that can do that. It'd be great to see more on this and more joined up thinking on autoimmune in general.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Julianne, and I'm looking forward to seeing the reaction to the episode and staying in touch.
Thanks for having me. It's been good talking.
Thanks everyone for listening and watching. Please hit subscribe where you're watching or listening so you don't miss out on future episodes. And please leave a review. It just takes 30 seconds and it really helps get these messages out there. And if you or anyone you know could benefit from a mental health tune-up, head over to metsci.com, where myself and psychiatrist Dr. Rachel Brown coach you to better mental health.